All right, recording chapter 2, 1 through 14. This time when we read, I would like us to try to get a sense for the rhetorical strategy that Paul is using. He gives a lot of his story, his experience, but as you can see, the closer we get to verse 15, where a real argument takes up, where he really starts to make his case about the material issues in front of them. Notice how the subject matter begins to transition toward that argument and away from his personal experience. There are some interesting details in these 14 verses that help us to see, at least I think what Paul is doing is very purposeful. So he is defending himself, but he's also using his defense and aiming it in a particular way. So we're going to look at some of these things in our discussion today, but as we read, see if you can get a feeling for that rhetorical strategy. Here we go. Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up in response to a revelation. Then I laid before them, though only in a private meeting with the acknowledged leaders, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure that I was not running, or had not run, in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not compelled to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. But because of false believers, false brothers, false brethren, secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might enslave us, we did not submit to them even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might always remain with you. And from those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders, what they actually were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those leaders contributed nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter, making him an apostle to the circumcised, also worked through me in sending me to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. They asked only one thing, that we remember the poor, which was actually what I was eager to do. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? Here endeth the reading of the word.
Thank you, God.
All right. I'll share my screen with you now. Let's get into it. All right. The first 10 verses still read like Paul's just describing what happened. And I ask us again to keep in mind that he's using what happened with particular aims in mind. And that's part of what gets us into the meat of the argument. So he mentions going to Jerusalem in response to a revelation, taking Titus with him, he and Barnabas. Let's go back and look at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. The first part of Acts 15, those first about 5 verses, summarize the controversy that is surfacing. And the controversy is the original church is all Jewish. These non-Jewish people are becoming followers of Jesus. And it raises the question about what is the gate? What are the entry criteria to become part of God's people? It's good for us to remember that being God's people is what the Jews are. We're kind of used to just using that language rather indiscriminately, but that meant something to them. And so this question is a big deal. What does it take to become part of God's people? And then we get verse 6 and following into the debate. And so you can sort of scan down through there. I don't want to read it all to you, but you can scan down through there and get a sense of the issue. And then in verse 13, James speaks decisively. So we get the sense that James has a certain kind of authority to pull the debate together and draw a conclusion. We don't get the sense that anybody's voting here, although something like that could have happened and it's just not recorded. But clearly, James is speaking with some authority. If you look at verse 19, after he's quoted from the scriptures, the Old Testament, therefore I have reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, but we should write to them to abstain only from things polluted by idols, from fornication, and from whatever has been strangled, and from blood. For in every city, generations past, Moses has had those who proclaim him, for he has been read aloud every Sabbath in the synagogues. One gets the sense there that for the sake of peace, if these Gentiles are going to come into the people of God, they really need to stop the most reprehensible of the pagan practices so that the Jewish believers aren't just troubled all the time. And then they write a letter to send to these new believers that Paul and Barnabas will take with them. Jump down to verse 28. For it has seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to impose on you no further burden than these essentials, that you abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication. If you keep yourselves from these, you will do well. Farewell. Now let's return to Galatians and look at what Paul says in Galatians relative to that counsel. Any observations, any thoughts?
Steve,
Yeah,
one observation is that in Galatians, we see that certain people came from James. But then in Acts, we see that James is the one who gave basically the answer that Paul was looking for. And
right.
so you wonder, who are these certain people who came from James, and does James know they came
Yeah,
from him?
right. Yeah, that little detail in the text plus some others reveal the rhetorical strategy that Paul is using. And it also gives us a hint at some background stuff that's pretty interesting, that I think helps us understand a little bit more why Paul takes the approach that he takes. Anybody else make an observation? I'm just asking you to think out loud a little bit. Okay.
Well, there was
Yeah.
the false brothers, or the infiltration people that he was alluding to in Galatians. I'm not sure that was said that way in Acts.
Right. And yes.
Well, there's also a lot of rules they're still putting on them, even though they don't need to be circumcised, that they lifted. You know, they didn't have in Galatians, but in Acts they did.
Right. Yeah. Paul kind of skips over those other criteria in Galatians, doesn't he, in this letter?
So they were probably in place there too.
Well, for the Jews, they were for sure. Yeah. Again, it's hard for us to grasp the weight of these bits of legislation. You know, abstaining from meat that's been sacrificed to idols. In one sense, that's very clear. In another sense, it would be hard for Jews to avoid, when you go to the market and buy meat, which meat was previously part of a religious ceremony in one of these pagan temples around here. So you remember,
it had been strangled.
Sorry?
Or if it had been strangled.
Right. Yeah, exactly. How do you know that? So the purification rituals that very committed Jews would go through after going to the marketplace makes sense from that Jewish perspective. Since we don't really know what's clean and unclean, we better just cleanse ourselves. At one level, that practice makes perfect sense, but you can also begin to sense the kind of anxiety always around whether you're pure or impure, clean or unclean. And if you get fixated on being clean, and if you're worried about being unclean, then that becomes the focus rather than a more fundamental kind of faithfulness to God. Is God the sort of God who really cares that much about cleanliness, such that if you don't really know what's happening in the pagan market, you've got to go through this ritual purification every time you come back to the market? I'm trying to give us a little bit of a feeling for the anxiety for purity that gets connected to the identity boundary behind the argument that's happening here in the book of Galatians.
Steve?
Yeah.
So, like, in fairness to the Jews, weren't breaking those laws punishable in some, I mean, from God's, not human perspective, but didn't God say, you know, if you don't follow the covenant that we have set between us, you know, it's going to be very bad for you?
Right. Yes. But then it raises the whole question about how the Jews understood that covenant. What are the terms? Where are the boundaries? This shows how understandable it is that the Jews get into what we would call case law. So a situation arises. How does the law apply to that situation? And then the judges would have to rule. They'd have to make a decision about it. And I mean, this is how law works, right? You've got these situations that arise. How does the law apply? How does federal or state law apply? Somebody's got to make a ruling. Then that ruling becomes part of the body of law that helps people know. Maybe I should say jurisprudence rather than law, the body of thinking, interpretation, so that people know how to abide by the law. I mean, it's in one sense, it just happens naturally in human experience. In this particular case, with regard to the covenant relationship with God, there's a heightened kind of sense about getting it right. But again, what I'm trying to get at is that this subtle shift in focus away from God to the law itself, and then to my identity, my righteousness in relation to the law. It's a very subtle shift, but that you can feel the anxiety kind of creeping in, that's more about loss of Jewish identity than it is faithfulness to God, even though in our thinking we connect those two, and the words we use may sound more like faithfulness to God, when really what I'm worried about is my own purity, my own identity. The closest modern example I can think of from my own experience is, I remember as a college kid, I grew up in a teetotaling household, and there's this Methodist holiness background that's part of it, plus my dad's experience with abusing alcohol before his conversion. So I really, when I went away to college, I just knew that if beer ever crossed my palate, I was going straight to hell. I mean, it wasn't get drunk, it was any amount of beer. Well, okay, that, is God really that concerned about that sort of issue? And yet, being a good Christian for me was very much tied up with a teetotaling identity. It was part of my testimony, if you could say it that way. And I'm hanging out with all these fraternity brothers and college students, and they're drinking and I'm not. And I had to kind of get over that. I have to protect my own identity a little bit. I hope this is coming through as roughly analogous to what we're finding here in the background with this argument in the book of Galatians.
Hey, Steve.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little curious why the strangulation is made the list. That's not clear to me, I guess.
Well, I'm going to speculate here a little bit, because that's something I don't know what the customs or practices were, but my sense is that it's actually a humanitarian concern. Strangulation, strangling an animal to death, first of all, it would take some work. And secondly, that's a very inhumane way to kill an animal if you're going to butcher the animal and use it. So even
it would
though
also, I mean, the law also had to do with whether or not the blood was retained
right
in the animal. And if you strangle it, you don't let the blood out.
Right.
And the blood is the life force.
Yeah.
And therefore the meaning there, the strangulation would not. If you go to a kosher butcher, I'm not saying this very well. If you go to a kosher butcher, though, they hang the meat in a certain way so that all the blood will drain. Well, it's going to be really hard if you if the animal's strangled.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. That's exactly right. That's definitely part of the picture. I think I don't know that necessarily explains the prohibition against strangulation, because an animal that's strangled is still going to be butchered. And so most of the blood could be drained out anyway. It may not be all of it, perhaps, in other words, pagans, other groups may not be that worried about how much blood may remain in the meat. So the prohibition against strangulation is I think still, it has to do with more than making sure all the blood drains out. Although I totally agree with you. You're right about that. I think, and I may be trying to dig something out of my memory here that's way back that I read 11 years ago about the connection between God's care for creation and the humanitarian treatment of animals in a biblical sense. If you go back to Genesis 1 and read what God commands the humans to do in regard to creation, one gets the sense that there's supposed to be a certain kind of care, stewarding for creation. That's what I'm trying to get at here. And it seems like strangulation may be a kind of a brutal way of doing it. I don't know. I may be trying to remember something that's actually there, and I may just be making this up, Mark, so I'm sorry.
That's helpful. Thanks.
All right, let's move on here. Paul says they went to Jerusalem in response to a revelation, and I call your mind to what he said before. I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. The gospel that he's preaching, he received as a revelation. Now, there's not necessarily any direct connection between 2:2 and 1:12, except that Paul is staking his claim to divine authority. This is an example of doing more than just defending him, defending himself. He's actually staking his claim. This is part of the rhetorical strategy. He also admits, even though I received it as a revelation, I do want to make sure I'm not running in vain. There's a sort of a double-edged character to Paul's attitude here. He's insisting that he has the authority, yet he also senses the need to be in communion or in fellowship with the leaders of the church. There are two sides to that coin. Now, the example of Titus, he makes the point that he took Titus along with him, and then look at verse 3. But even Titus, who was with me. Now, if you look at the closely there, so he says, I laid before them, though only in a private meeting with the acknowledged leaders. Would somebody read like the NIV or another version? How does the wording go in verse 2?
Well, I've got NIV here, and it's, I went in response to a revelation and set before them the gospel that I preached among the Gentiles. That I did this privately to those who seemed to be leaders, for fear that I was running or had run my race in vain.
That's interesting. Those who seem to be leaders. That's an interesting translation tactic.
My translation for that uses the term influential people.
Yes.
I have good news, which is a little different because we're talking Galatians 2, right?
Yeah.
I went because God revealed to me that I should go. In a private meeting with the leaders, I explained the gospel message that I preached to the Gentiles. I did not want my work in the past or in the present to be a failure.
Okay, so the good news simply says leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Give me just a second.
Yes.
Hi, I've got a different version.
Yeah, Patty.
Okay, so it is, but I did so in private to those who were of good reputation.
Yes. So the Greek word here, I can't get my eye on it right at the moment, has the connotation of esteemed leader or reputable leader or influential leader. So some of these other words, and it's so interesting, the NIV adds who seemed to be, so that creates a little doubt. And the Good News Bible just says leaders. doesn't really try to give that shade of meaning. And I think this is a really good example of why, when we read the Bible carefully, we should have more than one version, because we get this range of word choices, and I think it's beneficial for us to see what's going on here. The interesting thing to me about this is let me jump ahead to, if you look at, let's see. I'm trying to get my eye on it. Oh yeah, it's verse 6. And from those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders, that's how mine reads, the New Revised Standard. So the word acknowledged captures the Greek term. These leaders are esteemed, acknowledged, whatnot. But here in my verse 6, it says who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders. What they were doesn't matter to me, Paul says. So here we have the New Revised Standard including that shade of doubt a little bit, supposed to be. How about some alternative readings with verse 6?
Mine still says seem to be.
Okay.
Good news is saying.
Mine still says influential.
Okay. All right. Well,
Okay,
there's
mine
still,
Influential is
says-
interesting because it's without judgment.
yeah.
As
Mine says exalted reputation, high reputation, actually.
Yeah. So again, in Greek, it's the same word, but the English, there's variety in the English. All right, let me complicate this just a tad further. Look at verse 9. Mine reads about James and Cephas and John, who were acknowledged pillars. Again, the word acknowledged is that same Greek term, and this time it's an adjective here, and this time pillars is the noun.
My
Yeah.
says who seemed to be the leaders.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
mine says recognized.
Right.
And mine says reputed to be.
Okay, reputed is a little stronger than seemed, right? At least in my mind it is.
Yeah, seems very vague.
Doubtful.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, seem to be creates that little shadow of doubt. Are they really leaders, or do they just seem to be leaders? And these questions are important as we unpack some of the subtle details in this argument that Paul is making. Again, this is why I wanted us to look at, he is defending himself. He's telling what happened, but he's doing it in a way to set up where the argument's going to go. So he's doing more than just defending himself. All right, shall we move on? Well, I guess we move on by backing up. Because of false believers or brethren, and I put the Greek term transliterated there, you can see pseudo brothers. And I wanted us to notice how strong this language is in these verses. Secretly brought in, mine says, I'm reading from the New Revised Standard, who slipped in to spy on us. And then verse 5, we did not submit. We did not knuckle under. We did not kowtow to them even for a moment. Now, I'm curious in your verses 4 and 5, if false believers or brethren secretly, are those words pretty close to yours?
Mine says this. Even that question wouldn't have come up except for some so-called Christians there, false ones really, who came to spy on us and see our freedom in Christ Jesus. They wanted to force us like slaves to follow their Jewish regulations, but we refused to listen to them for a single moment. We wanted to preserve the truth of the good news for you. So that's a mouthful.
Yeah. And yours added in the Jewish regulations, which isn't actually in the text.
Oh,
So
really?
that's again, all translations interpret. So that verse helps us understand what the translators think we need to know, even though those words aren't in the text. Those translators think we need to understand that's what Paul means. That's what he's talking about.
Oh,
Yeah. This is really fascinating. It's one of those times when these versions have some variety that has, sometimes the word choices don't amount to much at all. And sometimes it seems like you can tell the translators are struggling a little bit, but struggling might not be the right word, but it's not just clear cut, straightforward. Everybody follows the same path. But again, back to, yeah, go ahead.
What does the Greek say? Your Greek Bible say?
On which question?
In your interpretation, on verse 4.
The false brothers, I've given you that word. And then the let's see here. The word for spying, false believers secretly brought in. There, that's the word I was looking for. Yeah, so secretly, the Greek term very literally would be, and this isn't literal precisely, but under the cover of darkness, darkly, secretly, darkly brought in. So secretly, I think in my version, I think it captures it. It's like shadow or darkness. And then
do you get the feeling they were sort of smuggled in?
well, that's as I kept working on this text this week, that's the feeling I began to get more and more. And a little bit more as we go through this text will come to light. But yeah, so this is clandestine activity, and they're claiming to be from James. All right, let's think this out for just a second since we're here on this point. It is very easy and understandable to read Paul and his anger as, wow, Paul's kind of over the top here. Some of that's just our modern tendency. We don't like church fights, and we don't like blunt talk very much generally. And it feels a little bit to us like a Twitter spat, perhaps. But what? Yeah.
Can I ask? Does the Greek also say they wanted to make slaves of us?
Yes, it does. It does say, it uses the word, a form of the word doulos for slave. Yeah, so slave, that's a pretty literal translation there. So that's the issue that Paul's focusing on, right? What they're doing is enslaving people, not freeing them in Christ. They're enslaving people. But what if there is, some sort of clandestine activity on the part of a group of people who claim the authority of James, the Jerusalem church, even if they don't really have that authority, and now they're imposing not just a severe rule, but they're imposing a rule that actually undermines the gospel. I'm asking us to try to get a feeling now for what is at stake. We can still say, this is what is at stake in Paul's view, and, wonder, is Paul right about this or not? We could keep talking about that, but what I'm trying to get at here is that even though he looks like he's defending himself in telling this story, he's actually trying to reveal some kind of dishonesty on the part of people within the church who aren't just imposing an unnecessary rule. From Paul's point of view, they're actually destroying the church. And that might be worth fighting over. Okay.
The word that oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Richard.
Well, this Bible's got lots of footnotes, and it says the adjective parasaktus, which relates to someone joining a group with false motives or false pretenses, applies to the false brothers. Although the expression false brothers and false pretenses is somewhat redundant, it captures the emphatic force of Paul's expression, which labels both those brothers, both these brothers, as false, with the using the term pseudodelphos that you have there on the board.
Right.
So it's I guess the reason this is so important, I suppose, is that it has to do with when we say the gospel, we mean the message of Christ, who Christ was, and what the effect of his death and resurrection was, and how that is going to work itself out as we know, in the coming millennium. But for Paul, in the future, before the return of Christ.
Right. Yes, and I think it's really interesting to keep in mind that once we get further into this book, Paul's going to argue that point that you just made, Richard, as a Jew. So Paul is not setting aside his Jewish identity to make this case.
No, he's interpreting who the Jewish Messiah is.
Yes, and he will also, when we get to chapter 3, show the basis for being part of the people of God for anybody, Jew or Gentile. It's not this kind of superficial, literally only skin deep circumcision way of thinking about identity. It goes much deeper. Jesus taught that it went much deeper in the Sermon on the Mount, and Paul will show that it goes much deeper when he looks at the scriptures in Galatians 3. So we're getting a little bit of a taste, I think, for the gravity within the Jewish community of Jesus being regarded as Messiah. And I'm asking us to imagine what it would be like to be part of a community that is having to work out these fundamental questions in real time. And so some people apparently are so alarmed at the prospects for Jewish identity that they are willing to fudge the truth a little bit for the sake of maintaining the boundary. And as soon as I say that, this starts to feel uncomfortably relevant. I mean, what we have here is church politics, right? And people are willing to be dishonest for the sake of their view of justice. And we should get the irony there.
I was thinking the exact same thing, Steve.
Yeah. This can go lots of different directions. Pick your faction, right? Pick your group. But the problem of a little bit of dishonesty, these people coming in, secretly spying on this, false brothers, pretending to be something, that they're acting in a clandestine way, and they're doing it because they believe they're upholding something good. This might be the best example of the power of sin at work in the world as anything. When people are willing to bend the rules to uphold other rules and do that without any sense of irony or penitence. Now we got trouble, right? Big trouble in River City. Okay, let us move on.
So we're also talking about a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah, I mean, in other places in the New Testament where that kind of language is used, yeah, it's the same issue here, which in a way is comforting, I think, to us. The problems we have today are in that sense not new. The church has always lived with conflict. That doesn't mean we become relativists, but it does mean we recognize it's just a normal part of church life. There's always going to be some conflict. Sometimes it's worse than others, but always disagreement. All right, I won't belabor this point because we'll come back to it, but he's setting up, Paul is, a theme: freedom in Christ and enslavement. I encourage us to keep in mind that freedom does not mean license. So we'll have to understand what Paul means by freedom. It's actually the kind of freedom that takes us deeper into self-discipline and care for others rather than toward more license. And he contrasts it with slavery, which everybody knew about. And a slave had absolutely no freedom unless granted by the master. Okay, we've touched on these things a little bit. Supposed to be acknowledged leaders, what they were. Again, I want us to notice the rhetorical tone here. Now, in 2:6, he says, those leaders contributed nothing to me. So who are those leaders? I've gone back and forth in my mind in this passage. And by the way, I want you to know this may seem odd. I'm doing my best to avoid just going to the commentaries and seeing what the scholars say, because I'm trying to, in that sense, model just reading for detail and working with it until I feel like I have a good sense, or we do. And then we can go to the commentaries. And if they correct me, that's great. If they don't, then, but the interaction with the text itself is what I'm really trying to model here and show is very important. So are James, Cephas, and John the supposed leaders here? Or is he talking about somebody else who are supposed leaders?
Well, to me, it's somebody in Jerusalem. I mean, that, he started out by saying that's where he went and he met with them. So
yeah, and some of them claim to have come from James. So there's ambiguity in the text. I'm inclined to think that what we're getting here is a sort of two-tiered hierarchy of leadership. James, Cephas, and John are acknowledged pillars, verse 9. And some of these other leaders who contributed nothing to Paul are maybe in some ways lower level leaders. I think we do get a little sense of other people involved in this controversy that Paul doesn't name. Now, I do want to, before we move on, and I'll come back to that point, I got to get to another slide, but I do want us to look at another really long sentence here. So verse 7, down through verse 9 is all one sentence. That's a long sentence with many subordinate clauses. And you can see what Paul is doing. And is he doing this on purpose, or are these words just tumbling out of him so rapidly that he is in effect thinking out loud? But look at what they say. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised, for he, Christ, who worked through Peter, making him an apostle to the circumcised, also worked through me in sending me to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. The repetition, the back and forth, there's a rhetorical impact to that. Keeps us focused, also gives a sense of urgency. And that parallels the one we didn't really look too much at earlier in 1:15 through 17. We won't go back there, but you see the kind of balance between Paul's apostleship to the uncircumcised and Peter's apostleship to the circumcised. And then verse 8, for he who worked through Peter also worked through me. We could say Paul's defending himself here. He is doing that, but he's also moving in the direction of pointing to the gospel. What really becomes central in the next few verses is, what is the nature of the gospel itself? The nature of the gospel itself is what determines who the gospel people are. So that the nature of the gospel and the nature of the gospel people get connected this way. Identity. What are the markers of identity for being part of the Messiah people, as N.T. Wright calls them, Jesus people? Yeah, so coming back to the point that we've been on, I asked this question about who should the Galatians heed? Who should they listen to? Did they listen to James, who oversaw the writing of the letter of the Jerusalem Council and did not require circumcision? That letter does not require circumcision. And these leaders who have infiltrated these Galatian churches are saying, oh, no. James does say that circumcision is required. Again, we get a little glimpse of the dishonesty, the shifting that's going on here, and perhaps some of the reason for Paul's fervor and zeal with which he speaks. So lower leaders are actually contramanding what the higher leaders had said. Okay, have we worked this enough? Anybody have a thought about that? I'm just kind of thinking out loud with you because I find this very good in preparing us for the argument that actually comes. It's really easy to read Paul's defending himself as he's just being defensive. But something was going on, even though he doesn't name who these people are. He could have named, could he not? Unless he just had no idea who they were, which means they're sneakier even than what we thought. But he could have named them, but it's sort of like if he knows their names, he doesn't want to credit them by naming them. But he does name James and Cephas and John.
Well, if he names the sneaky ones, he narrows it down to just those names. And there might be a lot more out there. So he's
right. Yeah. Right. I do have the sense, I may be making this up, but it's interesting to me that not naming them is a way of disrespecting them a little bit. Okay, enough of that. All right, let's turn now and look to Peter. Oh, golly, we can't. I'm sorry. It's 20 after. Yep. I'll just say this. When you, from 11 through 14, we turn away from Paul's defense of himself, and our attention falls on Peter. And given what we just said, Peter's behavior and his influence on Barnabas, perhaps, becomes particularly troubling. And everything we've read so far sets up seeing what Peter is doing in a pretty stark light, and it may help us understand why Paul confronts him so directly. But we'll have to work on that next week. Too much fun. Okay, let's pray. Well, God, we're grateful for this conversation as we think about conflicts and struggles that we know about and what these scriptures show us and how they can teach us and guide us. We pray for grace to be truthful always and to do all we can to honor your name. We pray for the Ealer family in this time of grief and mourning, and ask you to draw especially close to them. And we continue to remember those on our prayer list who face medical challenges. And we're glad for your faithfulness to them, and we pray that they would feel your strength as well. Bless us as we honor you today on this Lord's Day, and as we start a new week. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.